Hello, this is a homily for the second Sunday in Ordinary Time. That is the Sunday following the solemnity of the baptism of Jesus Christ. And you see a continuity of themes in these readings today. You have a beautiful call by Isaiah the prophet, obviously inspired by God. This is not him dreaming up something. And he says, "For Zion's sake I will not be silent, for Jerusalem's sake I will not be quiet, until her vindication shines forth." Now this is late Isaiah, so it's after the exiles, and this is a message of encouragement, of increasing of strength for Israel, so that they appreciate that God hasn't forgotten them. In other words, for us today, God hasn't forgotten us either. And what is happening here is Isaiah is saying, look, all of what Israel was designed for and created for is going to happen again. Don't forget, they have had centuries now of being beaten down. The two massive invasions, the exiles, and the destruction of the first temple. And so nations shall behold your vindication. So this is going to be a vindication. You suffered, and now you're going to be vindicated there, and nations will behold that. Very much in the line of the feast of the Epiphany, and also some of the themes that came out of the baptism of the Lord. And what we have here is that these events, even though they're happening in one tiny little country, are not to remain there. Their significance is a transformation, or if you look at the beginning of the Isaiah text for the previous week, the restoration of Israel, so that she can be, if you like, a sacrament, but not in the sense that we use it now, but a sign of some deep working of holiness that God is going to use Israel to manifest his glory. You will be called my delight, your land espoused. Land is an incredibly significant word in the Old Testament. Very similar to what we would understand by church in the New Testament, in the sense that land in the Old Testament is where you would be safe and where you could worship freely. And this is how we understand, at least part of the understanding of how we understand the church today. So you have the land being espoused to God in Isaiah. And if we look forward in time to, for example, the writings of St. Paul in the New Testament, you have the church being espoused to Christ. That's what makes the church the church. And so you have this wonderful notion of union, but also the notion of marriage, a very specific kind of marriage between a male and a female. In this case, the land is female, God is male, and the Lord then delights in you and makes your land his spouse, as a young man marries a virgin. Your builder shall marry you. And then, in a kind of a reference to married life, so shall your God rejoice in you. So we have this introduction of the theme of marriage being part of the vindication of Israel. The psalm then picks up that theme more about the vindication in terms of proclaiming God's marvelous deeds to all the nations. This is part of the work of Israel, to proclaim the glory of what God is doing for them in his marriage with them. This is now what God is going to do to the nations as well. Announce his salvation, give to the Lord. This is now an instruction to the nations themselves. Give to the Lord the glory due his name. Lastly, say through the nations, the Lord is king. In other words, we recognize, just as Israel recognized our position in this relationship, it's all in the hands of God. We are simply responding to it. We are not the ones who make the contract. We simply cooperate, very much in the line of Mary in her Magnificat, where she simply says, I am the handmaid of the Lord. The second reading is taken from the first letter to the Corinthians. So there we are in the New Testament, and Paul is talking about the gifts of the Spirit. Connecting this with the first reading, these are the gifts that would flow from God to his people, and in the New Testament, they are the gifts that flow from Jesus Christ to his church. In the marriage union, now understood in terms of Christ and his church, the gifts are things like faith, healing, the gift of deeds, prophecy, discernment, interpretation of tongues, distributed to each person as God wishes them to be distributed, because each person in the church has a very specific role, and that specific role they kind of discover as a result of being part of this union, marriage, between Christ and his church. Then we have the gospel, which is taken from John chapter 2, and it starts out immediately with, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. And so picking up the marriage theme that we've been looking at again and again, we have now Jesus and Mary being invited to the wedding and going to it. Now, what this does is it sanctifies marriage. A marriage between a man and a woman is sanctified because Jesus goes to the wedding. He is blessing it by his presence, just as he blessed the waters of the Jordan at his baptism. He blessed the waters. When we go to baptism, the waters bless us, obviously appropriate, accompanied with the appropriate words. But here you have Jesus then showing his favor to the marriage by, at Mary's request, providing wine, and doing it in terms of simply changing water into wine. And apparently this wine was of a very high quality, another sign of his bounty and his blessing to this marriage, that we hear nothing about the couple who are getting married. We are more focused on what Christ is doing at his mother's request. But the point of all of this is in the last 3 lines of the gospel. Jesus did this at the beginning of his signs at Cana in Galilee. Because he is such a unique figure, he has to act in a way that generates something that we can see, something that we can appreciate. And this particular sign, changing the water into wine, number 1, revealed his glory. And secondly, his disciples began to believe in him. They were actually convinced by this sign that he had done. And he does a whole series of these, pretty much regardless of which gospel you read. But John has actually designed his gospel in terms of the sequence of signs that Jesus does. And of course, the greatest sign of all is his death and resurrection. But the whole point is he's doing it in this world to show us what God is actually bringing about through him. The kingdom of God is already breaking out of his every appearance. It's just simply bursting out of every action that he does. Nice way to start the ordinary time. God bless.